think that faith has anything to do with food. You pray for strength, for wisdom, for provision, but not for appetite. You ask God to guard your heart, not your stomach. Yet, the first temptation humanity ever faced was not lust or pride or greed. It was hunger. It was the voice that whispered, "Take and eat." The fall of man began at a table, and since that day, every bite has carried a choice. Will you feed the body or the soul? Modern believers rarely see this battle. We are surrounded by abundance, yet starved of reverence. We thank God for blessings, and then consume them without thought. We eat for comfort, for boredom, for habit, but not for gratitude. We feed the body until the spirit grows drowsy. Gluttony is not just overeating, it is over-forgetting. It is the act of forgetting why you were given sustenance in the first place. The Bible speaks gently but firmly. Whether you eat or drink, do all to the glory of God. It is not about rules. It is about remembrance. Food was meant to remind you that you are dependent on grace, that every seed and harvest is a covenant of mercy. When you eat without gratitude, you silence that reminder. You begin to worship pleasure instead of purpose, and pleasure, once enthroned, becomes a tyrant. The first eating habit that weakens faith is consuming without consciousness. You eat, but you do not notice. You swallow quickly, distracted, scrolling through noise, unaware that you are partaking in a divine exchange. You forget that what enters the body shapes the mind that prays. The distracted eater trains his heart to take gifts for granted. Over time, that same carelessness creeps into prayer, into relationships, into worship. Reverence erodes not through rebellion, but through routine. Gratitude dies in the absence of attention. The second habit is eating for escape. You do not seek food because you are hungry. You seek it because you are hollow. You use flavor to silence fear, sweetness to cover sadness, fullness to hide emptiness. But the stomach was never meant to carry the burdens of the heart. Every time you eat to escape, you teach your body that satisfaction comes from the outside, not the inside. The spirit begins to weaken because it has been replaced by sugar for solace. And what you feed in moments of pain eventually rules you in moments of peace. The third habit is gluttony disguised as celebration. You call it joy, but it is excess. You eat not to honor the moment, but to drown it. You no longer feast, you overfill. The ancient feasts of Scripture were not about indulgence. They were about remembrance, reminding the people that everything came from God and must return to Him. Today, we celebrate without sanctity, pleasure without purpose. The table becomes an altar to appetite, and we wonder why discipline fades. Gluttony is not punished because it is ugly. It is punished because it makes the soul forget who is Lord. The fourth habit is neglecting nourishment. Some believers, in the name of busyness or pride, starve the body while pretending to feed the spirit. They rush through meals, skip rest, treat exhaustion as holiness. But neglect is not discipline, it is disobedience. The God who created your soul also created yourselves. He asked you to steward both. A weary body weakens prayer. A starved body cannot sing. When you deny yourself care, you teach yourself that pain equals piety. Yet Christ himself rested, broke bread, drank wine, and showed that true devotion includes the care of creation. The fifth habit is wastefulness. You throw away what others pray for. You let food rot while asking heaven for abundance. Waste is the sin of forgotten gratitude. When you waste what was once alive, you mock the miracle of provision. Every loaf represents labor, soil broken, rain fallen, hands worked. To discard it without thanks is to discard grace. The faithful heart uses, shares, multiplies. The careless one consumes and forgets. The measure of gratitude is not how loud you thank God before eating, but how wisely you treat what remains after. The sixth habit is idolatry of health. At first it seems holy to care for the body, to exercise discipline, but obsession with fitness can become a golden calf made of mirrors and meal plans. You start to worship your reflection instead of your Redeemer. You fast not to focus on God, but to feed vanity. You spend more time counting calories than counting blessings. This, too, weakens faith, for pride can dress in the garments of self-control. The body is a temple, not a trophy. Stewardship was meant to inspire gratitude, not arrogance. And the seventh habit, the quietest, deadliest of all, is forgetting the table as communion. The early believers broke bread with reverence, knowing that each meal was a small echo of the Last Supper. To eat together was to remember grace, forgiveness, unity. Today we eat alone, rushed, divided, staring into screens instead of faces. We have replaced communion with convenience, and when we stop breaking bread together, we stop breaking pride together. Loneliness grows where gratitude dies. The table was meant to be the meeting place of heaven and earth. Now it has become a countertop of hurry. Each of these habits may seem harmless, but together they sing a slow hymn of forgetfulness. The devil does not always tempt you with catastrophe. Sometimes he tempts you with comfort. He does not need to steal your faith outright. He only needs to feed your distractions until you grow too full for devotion. And make no mistake, the one who controls your appetite controls your attention. But here lies the good news. Awareness is redemption. The moment you remember, the chains begin to loosen. When you stop eating blindly, you begin to taste again not just the flavor of food, but the flavor of gratitude. When you stop eating to escape, you start eating to restore. When you eat slowly, gratefully, prayerfully, you remember that every bite is borrowed breath, every meal a sermon on provision. You begin to see food as God's language. Bread speaks of sustenance, water of renewal, fruit of sweetness born through patience. You learn that cooking is not chore, but communion, that sharing is not charity, but worship. The kitchen becomes sacred ground when your heart turns the act of feeding into an act of faith. Even washing dishes becomes praise when done with awareness that nothing in the kingdom is wasted. To eat in faith is not to reject pleasure, but to redeem it. God never asked you to despise flavor. He asked you to delight in it without dependence. Taste was his invention, but addiction was man's corruption. When you reclaim delight as gratitude instead of gluttony, pleasure becomes prayer. The believer who blesses his meal with sincerity consumes peace alongside nourishment. And then, slowly, your relationship with food mirrors your relationship with life. You stop rushing, start savoring. You stop hoarding, start sharing. You stop escaping, start engaging. Every meal becomes a lesson in balance. Eat enough to live, not to forget. Give enough thanks to remind yourself who gave it. Discipline begins at the table. If you can say no to the second slice you do not need, you will find it easier to say no to the temptation you should not touch. Self-control is one fruit of the Spirit, and it grows where gratitude is planted. Every time you restrain appetite, you strengthen authority. The same muscle that closes your mouth against excess opens your heart to obedience. And when you begin to live this way, awake, aware, grateful, your very presence changes. The same Spirit that once reached for food to fill emptiness now reaches for purpose to feed others. You begin to serve rather than consume, to bless rather than demand. Your table becomes testimony. Those who eat with you feel peace because you have remembered what the table was for. Remembrance, fellowship, reverence, love. Once awareness takes root, you begin to see that eating is never only about the mouth. Every choice you make at the table reverberates through the Spirit. The bite you swallow without thought shapes the mind that prays. The morsel you consume with greed or haste echoes in the heart that worships. Every habit of indulgence or neglect becomes a chord in the symphony of your soul, and the longer you ignore it, the louder it plays, until you are singing someone else's song without realizing it. You begin to understand that discipline is sacred. It is not the oppression of enjoyment, but the invitation to wisdom. To eat deliberately is to reclaim authority over your body and mind. You learn that restraint is not punishment, it is preparation. Each refusal of excess is a rehearsal for faithfulness. Each pause before indulgence becomes a prayer. And the miracle is that God does not require perfection. He requires participation. He asks only that you choose awareness, that you honor the gift of sustenance as He intended. Slowly, you notice subtle changes. You begin to crave nourishment over mindless pleasure. Fruits, grains, water. The simple gifts of creation, they taste richer because your heart is awake. You begin to fast not out of desperation, but out of devotion. You eat to sustain, to celebrate, to remember. And in those meals, you hear whispers of the divine, faint but unmistakable, telling you that the kingdom is present even in the simplest act. Those who once dismissed the table as mundane now see it as altar. Each meal becomes ritual. Breaking bread becomes not routine, but reverence. Even the smallest gestures, pouring water, breaking a piece of bread, offering a plate to another, become acts of worship. You learn that service is the spice that turns the ordinary into the holy. The kitchen, once a place of utility, becomes a classroom for the soul. And as your awareness grows, you realize that what you teach your body, you also teach your mind and spirit. Gluttony, once subtle, now appears for what it is: theft of sanctity. Escape eating reveals its deception. No amount of sugar or fat can truly fill a hollow heart. And obsession with appearance, this golden calf of vanity, shows its emptiness when discipline is prioritized. The soul begins to reject indulgence that does not honor God, even when the flesh protests. And in those moments of resistance, faith grows stronger than desire. You begin to see that every temptation is an opportunity to practice obedience, every craving a lesson in stewardship. The awareness of waste also begins to dawn. You cannot take lightly the gift of provision. The fields, the rain, the labor of unseen hands, the divine blessing that brought your food to your plate, all of it demands gratitude. To discard, to ignore, to consume thoughtlessly is to participate in unfaithfulness. But to share, to honor, to eat with intention is to walk in alignment with the Creator. The table becomes a sanctuary, a place where generosity transforms a meal into a miracle. As your relationship with eating matures, your entire life begins to mirror the rhythm of the table. Discipline learned in one area radiates outward. Self-control over appetite becomes control over words, over thoughts, over actions. You discover that moderation at meals teaches moderation in conduct. That reverence in preparation fosters reverence in prayer. That awareness in consumption nurtures awareness in conversation. Your entire existence starts to harmonize with the divine pattern that God intended. And joy begins to emerge where once there was only routine, not shallow happiness, but deep contentment, the kind that the Bible promises to those who walk in obedience. Each meal becomes a microcosm of life, measured, meaningful, and full of gratitude. You no longer eat out of fear, loneliness, or distraction. You eat to live, and in living you discover the abundance of God. The body is fed, the mind is focused, the spirit is strengthened. The enemy's whispers begin to lose their power. Where once indulgence ruled, now discernment governs. Where once you sought comfort to escape, now you seek nourishment to serve. Where once you glorified vanity, now you glorify stewardship. You begin to notice that the greatest battles are not external. They are fought quietly, within, at the place where appetite and attention meet. And victory is won not through dramatic confrontation, but through daily obedience. In this rhythm of life, fasting and feasting alike take on new significance. To fast is to sharpen awareness, to remember dependence on God. To feast is to celebrate provision, to honor His generosity. Every act becomes intentional, and intention becomes a conduit for blessing. The mundane becomes magnificent. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. The table becomes the theater in which you practice reverence, gratitude, and love. And soon you realize that this is not just about food. It is about the soul's capacity to listen, to choose, to obey. Eating becomes a mirror, reflecting back your spiritual discipline. To consume wisely is to think wisely. To savor slowly is to pray earnestly. To give generously is to love wholeheartedly. The lessons of the table stretch into every interaction, every decision, every thought. Faith becomes embodied, not abstract. Belief becomes tangible, not theoretical. You will notice, too, that others are affected by your transformation. Family and friends begin to respond to your calm presence, your measured behavior, your reverent approach to life. The atmosphere at shared meals changes. Conversation deepens. Laughter becomes lighter. Tension dissipates. Your commitment to faith at the table radiates outward, touching lives without preaching a single word. This is the silent testimony of obedience, the power of internal harmony manifesting externally. And the more consistently you live in this awareness, the more your entire being aligns with God's purpose. Physical health improves because care becomes habit. Mental clarity sharpens because distraction is minimized. Spiritual resilience strengthens because each choice of discipline reinforces trust. You start to understand that faith is not a part of life to be compartmentalized. It is a lens through which every act, including eating, is filtered. Eventually, eating is no longer merely sustenance. It becomes sacrament. You are able to receive food as a gift, to honor it as blessing, to consume it as an act of gratitude, and in doing so, you are reminded that every blessing in life, whether material or spiritual, must be acknowledged, respected, and stewarded. Neglect, indulgence, escapism, gluttony, vanity, wastefulness, and forgetfulness are all neutralized, not by fear, but by deliberate awareness. The full transformation occurs when these habits no longer dominate your behavior unconsciously. Your choices become intentional. You pray before meals, not out of obligation, but from reverence. You serve others before yourself, not to impress, but to honor. You fast without resentment. You feast without greed, and you nourish your body in alignment with your soul. Your faith is no longer theoretical. It is operational. Every bite, every sip, every pause carries spiritual weight. At last, you realize that this attention to eating, to stewardship of the body, is itself an act of worship. It is not ritualistic, but relational. It is not performative, but participatory. You are entering into a covenant, not just of obedience, but of understanding. The habits that once weakened you have been transformed into instruments of strengthening. Your body, mind, and spirit are aligned. And in that alignment, you discover the fullness of faith. God is present in the ordinary. Holiness is accessible in the mundane, and obedience is a path to joy. As you continue walking this path, you begin to notice subtle occurrence in your relationship with food. It is no longer simply what you put into your body, but how you engage with the act itself. Eating becomes a mirror to the soul. Every choice, every portion, every moment of restraint or indulgence reflects the state of your spirit. You realize that faith is practiced not only in prayer or study, but in vigilance over your own appetite. It is here, in these quiet daily decisions, that the battle for integrity is fought. The awareness of what you consume begins to sharpen your discernment in all things. The same attentiveness that prevents gluttony prevents spiritual compromise. The same reverence that transforms a meal into worship transforms words into blessings, thoughts into prayers, moments into opportunities for grace. You begin to understand that discipline is not a burden, but a bridge. The more you govern the body, the more freedom you find in the soul. You are learning that obedience is not restriction, it is empowerment. You also notice the interconnection between eating and attention. Eating in a state of distraction, scrolling, talking without listening, rushing, teaches the soul to rush through prayer, to skim over scripture, to approach devotion with half-heartedness. Every bite swallowed mindlessly is a rehearsal for spiritual numbness. But eating with mindfulness, the act of acknowledging the source of your sustenance, giving thanks for the labor that produced it, savoring the texture, the aroma, the taste, awakens gratitude, and gratitude awakens faith. The act of mindful eating becomes a metaphor for mindful living. Then comes the recognition of emotional eating. Every morsel consumed to dull fear, sadness, loneliness, or boredom is a temptation that weakens faith by displacing trust in God with temporary satisfaction. You see clearly that every time you have turned to food to manage feelings, you have unwittingly trained your spirit to seek relief from the created rather than the Creator. You understand that to eat is not merely to fill the stomach, but to nourish the soul. When food is misused, it sedates the spirit, dulls perception, and dims awareness. Each conscious refusal to indulge in emotional escapism becomes a small act of triumph in faith. The lessons of moderation emerge. You begin to understand that portion control is more than physical discipline. It is moral training. The restraint exercised in the kitchen translates to restraint in relationships, in finances, in speech, in thought. Each conscious decision to eat what is necessary, rather than all that is tempting, becomes a template for spiritual prudence. Your life begins to take on a rhythm of wisdom. Even pleasure becomes ordered, because it is now in service to purpose rather than passion. You also see the power of fasting. Fasting is no longer simply a ritualistic abstention from food. It is a strategic act of the will, a deliberate attunement to the divine. Every hour spent resisting hunger becomes an hour spent strengthening your spirit, honing discernment, and deepening reliance on God. Through fasting, you learn the difference between need and desire, between gratitude and greed, between submission to God and surrender to impulse. The discipline of fasting extends beyond the body to cultivate resilience in the mind and steadfastness in the heart. Sharing food becomes a sacrament of community. You understand that generosity in meals mirrors generosity in spirit. The act of providing sustenance to others, especially those in need, cultivates humility and compassion. It transforms the table from a place of personal satisfaction into a platform for blessing. In this way, eating becomes a conduit for obedience, a medium through which faith is not only preserved, but multiplied. Each shared meal is a note in a larger symphony of service and devotion, echoing the principle that our lives are not meant for ourselves alone. Then there is the joy of simplicity. You discover that a meal does not need extravagance to be holy. Simple, wholesome food, consumed with awareness, becomes more nourishing than the richest banquet consumed without intention. You learn that abundance is not measured by quantity, but by quality of attention and reverence. Every modest bite can teach a lesson in humility, gratitude, and mindfulness. In simplicity, the mind rests, the spirit wakes, and the heart remembers that every blessing is a gift, not a right. As your practices solidify, the 7 habits that once weakened your faith begin to transform. Conscious consumption neutralizes mindless eating. Mindful attention counteracts distraction. Disciplined restraint tames gluttony. Gratitude heals indulgence. Generosity negates waste. Reverence counters vanity. Fasting strengthens reliance on God rather than flesh. Slowly, your body, mind, and spirit begin to resonate in harmony with the divine rhythm. Every meal becomes an opportunity for growth. Every bite, a reaffirmation of faith. And with this harmony comes a subtle yet profound peace. You no longer approach food with anxiety, guilt, or indulgence. You no longer eat as a way to avoid life or fill emptiness. You eat to live, to celebrate, to remember. Each act of consumption is conscious, each meal a practice of faith. The ordinary table becomes extraordinary. The mundane act of eating becomes a sacrament of the soul. You see that faith is not diminished by attention to daily habits. Rather, it is deepened, strengthened, and sanctified through them. Your relationship with God begins to transform. Prayer is more attentive, worship more heartfelt, obedience more joyful. You notice how even the simplest acts, pouring water, breaking bread, passing food, become moments of sacred interaction. Every meal becomes a rehearsal for heaven. You learn that holiness is not a distant ideal, but a present practice, achievable in the ordinary rhythms of life when approached with awareness and intention. You start to influence others. Family and friends notice the change not just in your eating, but in your entire demeanor. Calm replaces haste. Gratitude replaces complaint. Discipline replaces indulgence. Your table becomes a place of teaching without words, a witness to faith in practice. People who eat with you feel a subtle shift in atmosphere. Even silence in these moments becomes meaningful, filled with reverence. Your habits shape not only your own spirit, but the environment around you, creating ripples of blessing that extend far beyond the plate. As your awareness grows, you begin to see the subtle connections between what you eat and how you live. The body is a temple, and every habit of consumption either builds it or erodes it. You notice that when you overindulge, the mind grows restless, prayer becomes shallow, and patience thins. When you eat without discipline, even your thoughts stagger. Conversely, when you eat intentionally, slowly, gratefully, wisely, clarity returns. Your spirit aligns with your actions, and every bite becomes a step toward holiness. The practice of moderation becomes a form of worship. You no longer measure meals in calories or taste alone. You measure them in mindfulness, in acknowledgement of God's provision. Each meal is a miniature offering, a daily act of recognition that the Creator sustains you. You learn that every blessing consumed with awareness strengthens faith, while every indulgence swallowed unconsciously weakens it. Even the simplest foods carry moral weight when approached with reverence. Your fasting becomes more than abstention. It becomes training of the will. The hunger you feel is not merely physical, but spiritual, a reminder of dependence on God, a clarion call to discipline. In resisting the temptation to fill the body at every impulse, you train yourself to resist temptation in every area of life. You realize that self-control in small matters translates to strength in larger matters. The bite you deny today teaches you to deny the urgencies of pride, envy, and indulgence tomorrow. Then comes generosity. You notice how giving of your resources, sharing food with the hungry, inviting others to the table, providing meals for those who cannot afford them, transforms not only their lives but yours. Each act of sharing becomes an echo of God's generosity. You are reminded that sustenance is not meant to be hoarded, that provision is a responsibility, that abundance is a gift to steward. And every time you feed someone else, you feed your own soul as well. Gratitude deepens into devotion. You no longer consume without thought. The taste of bread reminds you of God's covenant. The sweetness of fruit reminds you of his patience. The water you drink reminds you of the living water that satisfies eternally. Every meal becomes a meditation, a practice of remembering that you are held in the hands of the Creator. You are no longer distracted. Your attention rests on the divine, and faith grows stronger with every conscious choice. You begin to notice the spiritual weight of waste. Throwing away what is edible becomes a form of negligence, a failure to honor the labor, the providence, and the blessing that brought the food to your plate. Mindless disposal becomes a habit of forgetfulness, a small but significant weakening of the spirit. In contrast, thoughtful use, preservation, and sharing of food become acts of gratitude and faith. Stewardship of what is given reflects stewardship of all that God entrusts to you. The discipline you cultivate at the table extends into every aspect of life. Eating with intention fosters patience. Consuming with gratitude cultivates humility. Resisting indulgence builds fortitude. Sharing generously nurtures compassion. The body and soul begin to harmonize. You see that what once appeared as a mundane daily ritual eating is actually a proving ground, a place to practice faith, to exercise discernment, and to cultivate virtue. This transformation is subtle but powerful. Over time, your inner life grows steadier. You no longer chase pleasure at the expense of principle. You do not succumb to distraction or fear. You become grounded, not in rigidity, but in rhythm, an ordered life flowing in accordance with divine principles. Eating becomes a template for discipline, mindfulness, and obedience. Your body, mind, and spirit no longer exist in conflict, but in concord. And as this alignment strengthens, the influence extends beyond yourself. Family, friends, and community feel the shift. Meals shared become opportunities for teaching and example. Children learn reverence for provision. Friends see calmness where there was previously chaos. Even strangers feel the subtle power of a life harmonized. You realize that the faith cultivated at your own table radiates outward, influencing the atmosphere around you. You also come to understand the joy of sufficiency. When the appetite is governed by discipline and gratitude, every portion is satisfying. You do not need excess to feel content. You learn that abundance is measured not by quantity, but by awareness. The soul that eats with intention finds fullness in simplicity. Pleasure is no longer a tyrant, but a gift. Every meal becomes a celebration, every taste a reminder of God's faithfulness. Your relationship with God itself deepens. Prayer becomes more attentive, worship more heartfelt, obedience more deliberate. You see the connections between body and soul, action and belief. Faith is no longer abstract, it is lived. Eating becomes a rehearsal for devotion, a daily exercise in aligning desire with discernment, consumption with conscience. Every choice reinforces the covenant between Creator and creation, reminding you that holiness is not distant, but present in the ordinary. And in time, the 7 habits that once weakened your faith, mindless consumption, eating for escape, gluttony disguised as celebration, neglect of the body, wastefulness, obsession with appearance, and forgetting the table as communion begin to reverse. Conscious eating replaces mindless eating. Gratitude replaces distraction. Moderation counteracts gluttony. Care replaces neglect. Stewardship counteracts waste. Reverence replaces vanity. Sharing replaces isolation. Faith is strengthened, not diminished, by the choices made at each meal. Your life becomes a living example. Others see the peace and discipline cultivated through attention to these seemingly small actions. They witness the calm presence, the steady character, the intentional living. Your table becomes a sanctuary. Your meals, prayers, your choices, testimony. The faith that was once weak through unconscious habits now flourishes through vigilance, mindfulness, and obedience. And you begin to understand a profound truth. The body is not separate from faith. It is the vessel through which faith is exercised. Discipline at the table is discipline of the soul. Mindfulness in consumption is mindfulness in worship. Gratitude in provision is gratitude in life. Each bite, each pause, each conscious choice is a step in the long path of spiritual formation, a practice of aligning flesh and spirit with divine intention. As your practice of mindful eating becomes habit, subtle transformations begin to emerge. You notice patience emerging where once there was haste, gratitude where once there was complaint, and reverence where once there was neglect. Each meal becomes a mirror reflecting your spiritual growth. Every choice to pause before indulgence, to eat with intention, to honor God's provision, strengthens your character in ways that ripple far beyond the table. The act of feeding the body becomes a discipline of the heart, an exercise of obedience, and a rehearsal for the life you are meant to live. The true power of this transformation is revealed in resilience. Life will continue to test you. Temptations will appear. Schedules will press. Stress will mount. And old habits will whisper their familiar songs. But now, fortified by intentional habits of consumption, you discover that you can meet these trials with steadiness. You are no longer carried away by impulses because your faith has been trained to govern desire. Hunger, once merely physical, becomes spiritual, calling you to remember dependence on God rather than indulgence. Each controlled bite, each mindful choice builds fortitude that strengthens every aspect of your life. You begin to see that true freedom is not the liberty to eat what you want when you want, but the discipline to choose what is best. You learn that freedom without wisdom is bondage, and indulgence without awareness enslaves the soul. The body, trained through careful attention, becomes a partner in faith rather than a distraction from it. The hunger you resist today fortifies the will to resist sin tomorrow. The discipline exercised at the table extends into your finances, your words, your relationships, and your prayers. You discover that mastery of self in one area strengthens mastery in all areas. And as your awareness spreads, you realize the spiritual significance of provision itself. Every bite becomes an encounter with God's mercy. Every meal, a reminder of labor, season, rain, soil, and blessing. You see that abundance is a sacred trust, that every gift from heaven is a covenant, and that to waste it is to forget the giver. Sharing meals, feeding the hungry, offering nourishment to others, these acts become sacred, not merely for the recipient, but for your own spirit. In generosity, faith is exercised, strengthened, and displayed. The table becomes a place of ministry, a temple of service, a living testimony of God's provision. The seventh habit, the one that often goes unnoticed, is the cultivation of thanksgiving. Saying grace becomes more than a formality. It becomes the practice of recognition. To name the blessing aloud is to bind the heart to awareness. The act of gratitude transforms ordinary food into sacred sustenance. The mind that learns to recognize every bite as a gift begins to recognize every moment of life as a gift. Each taste, each aroma, each morsel carries the weight of divine intention, and acknowledging it trains the spirit to see God in all things. Through this awareness, your faith matures. You discover that God's care extends to the smallest details, and that attention to these details is itself an act of devotion. Faith is no longer abstract, it is embodied. The daily discipline of consumption becomes an ongoing sermon to the self, a conversation with the Creator, a continual reinforcement of the principles you wish to live by. Through intentional eating, you cultivate humility, gratitude, discipline, and service, the very virtues that sustain a robust and unshakable faith. You also notice the subtle influence on community. Family members and friends begin to feel the difference. The meals you share are calmer, more intentional, more joyful. Children learn through example that gratitude and discipline are intertwined, that respect for provision is a virtue, that sharing is sacred. Conversations deepen, tension diminishes, and the atmosphere itself becomes infused with peace. Your mindful eating reshapes not only your own life, but the environment around you, demonstrating that faith practiced in small acts radiates beyond the self. And slowly you understand a profound truth. The small decisions of daily life, what to eat, how to eat, when to eat, reflect the larger choices of your soul. To allow gluttony, distraction, indulgence, or vanity at the table is to allow them in your heart, in your mind, and in your faith. Conversely, to practice discipline, awareness, and gratitude in eating is to exercise authority over your entire life. Faith is reinforced by practice. Character is forged through consistency. Holiness is expressed through obedience to the ordinary. Eventually, you no longer view meals as mundane. Each plate, each glass, each act of consumption becomes sacramental. You eat with mindfulness, pray with intention, share with generosity, and rejoice with gratitude. The body is sustained, the mind is focused, the spirit is strengthened, and the soul is nourished. Eating, once merely physical, becomes a holistic practice of faith. You understand that God cares about the vessel as well as the prayer, the stomach as well as the heart, the table as well as the sanctuary. Through this holistic transformation, your entire life begins to resonate with divine order. You begin to see the invisible threads connecting action and intention, body and spirit, consumption and devotion. Faith is no longer compartmentalized. It permeates every thought, every choice, every interaction. Your eating habits, once a source of weakness, have become a training ground for spiritual resilience. You no longer need to escape or avoid the challenges of life. You meet them with strength born of daily practice. And as the final layers of awareness settle, you realize the scope of transformation. The 7 habits that once undermined your faith, mindless consumption, emotional eating, gluttony, neglect, wastefulness, vanity, and forgetfulness, have been replaced by consciousness, gratitude, moderation, care, stewardship, humility, and communion. The table is no longer a place of temptation, but a place of triumph. Each meal reinforces discipline. Each choice affirms faith. Each act manifests holiness. You are no longer a passive participant in life. You are a co-creator of your spiritual rhythm. Finally, you see the ultimate truth. The path to unshakable faith is not through extraordinary acts or miraculous events, but through the ordinary choices of daily life. Eating becomes a microcosm of obedience. Each bite is a decision to honor God. Each pause a chance to reflect. Each act of restraint a training of the will. The seemingly small, mundane rituals carry immense spiritual weight. Your faith is strengthened not by grand gestures, but by consistency in these ordinary acts. And in this realization, the ordinary transforms into the extraordinary. Meals are no longer routine, they are ritual. Eating becomes prayer, sharing becomes service, preparation becomes praise. Your body, mind, and spirit harmonize. Your faith is fortified, your character strengthened, your life aligned, and every meal becomes a living testament to God's provision, mercy, and grace.